Okay, so thanks to Arlette for kind of setting the stage for what we're going to be looking at for the rest of the panel discussion today. So my angle on this whole radicalization in quotation marks, we did that purposely. Scott was very astute in kind of pointing out that we should put that in quotation marks because we are trying to question what it is that we mean by radicalization. So I'm going to be focusing on it more from a model of understanding radicalization. But more importantly though, how we understand something like radicalization comes from how we look at it under the climate of hate, right? Because that's what I'm trying to get at here in terms of A, how we understand the definition itself, and B, what does this climate of hate actually look like? And based on what's been going on in the world the past few months, we're seeing the climate of hate quite strongly happen. Not so much here in Canada yet, but we're seeing quite strongly in Europe what this climate of hate looks like, especially as it relates to how we understand who is the radical. Right? Apparently, they look like me, right? But I'm here to tell you that's not the case. That's definitely not the case. And I want to give us one model for how we can understand what radicalization is. So Arlette gave us a really good definition to consider, and I'm going to pose 3 different definitions that all have one common theme and one common thread. Well, 2 common threads. One, none of them are academic, and I did that on purpose. All of them come from some form of government agency responsible for addressing terrorism and addressing radicalization. So we kind of get a sense of what, from the policy side, some of these definitions look like. So starting off with, of course, the best definition, right? U.S. Homeland Security. Radicalization, the process of adopting an extremist belief system, including the willingness to use, support, or facilitate violence as a method to effect social change. Right? So that's what the U.S. Department of Homeland Security defines as radicalization. I thought fairly neutral. Right? I thought it could be a little bit more loaded than maybe we might have expected. The Danish Security and Intelligence Services define radicalization this way: a process by which a person, to an increasing extent, accepts the use of undemocratic or violent means, including terrorism, in an attempt to reach a specific political or ideological objective. So again, fairly broad in terms of how it's applied. And one thing I noticed a lot with these types of definitions, and we see it quite a bit here in Canada as well, they're broad and vague on purpose, so they have broad application. The Swedish Security Service, I found their definition to be the most interesting. Radicalization can be both a process that leads to ideological or religious activism. So this is the first definition that throws religion in there. To introduce radical change to society, and a process that leads to an individual or group using, promoting, or advocating violence for political aims. So each of these definitions, and for every 3 we presented here, there's another 20 that you can find elsewhere. Arlette showed us a few other definitions as well. But building off of what her definition talked about, these 3 also have one common thread. And I'm going to get into like classroom mode here and say, did anyone pick out what that common thread is?
Violence.
Somewhat. Yeah, a process. Absolutely. Right? Arlette touched upon it earlier, and each of those other definitions talked about it as well. We look at radicalization as a process. Oftentimes, we get caught up with that word radicalization, right? So I think it was really interesting what you talked about. I can't remember who you quoted, but radicalization is an issue. It's terrorism, right? But oftentimes, too much focus is spent looking at radicalization. We look at what's happening in our own province right now, our own country, where every single police force, their main agenda right now is to combat radicalization. What does that mean? What does that look like? They don't know, right? We don't know. But at the same time, they have to keep the public safe. And based on what's been going on globally, that's the mandate that they have to ensure we feel something is being done. In my context, it's more so they think that they're doing something, right? And so the first thing is we try to understand the process. So that's what I wanted to kind of look at for the rest of the discussion here is what does that process look like? I found one model, and this is by Peter Newman, and he's the director of the International Center for the Study of Radicalization in the United Kingdom. And he looked at about 30 or so different models of definitions of radicalization from different government agencies, different law enforcement agencies, and different political systems. And what he found, there was 3 themes that emerged in all 3 of these models or definitions. He found grievance, ideology, and mobilization to be the 3 common threads in these 30 definitions. Now, it's really important that he also pointed out that, and Arlette pointed out as well, it doesn't necessarily mean that this will lead people to violent extremism, right? But these are some of the factors he found in these definitions. So I'm going to break down each one, but I want to use a sense of caution for us to think about this model from. Because A, we all have some form of grievance, right? We all are also guided by some form of ideology. And we also all mobilize these grievances or these ideologies in different ways, whether that be activism, whether that be protest, whether that be even voting. Very few, though, go towards violent extremism. But of course, that's the ones we only hear about, and that's the ones that gets the attention, and as a result, that's also the ones that provide knee-jerk reactions to focus more so on radicalization as a process, but a process that might have an end goal, right? Because that's often what law enforcement specifically tries to get, is how can we identify those individuals becoming radicalized to prevent violent extremism, right? These same discussions we're having right now with radicalization, you can back up to the 90s and replace radicalization with a gang involvement. And the exact same discussions are happening in Canada on the same issue, just replacing radicalization with gang involvement. So with that caution in mind, I want to walk us through his model, because I do find that it has some useful ways of trying to think about radicalization beyond just what we might be tempted to do from a faith-based perspective, right? Because I think talking what Arlette looked at earlier, that knee-jerk reaction of looking at radicalization connected to a certain faith, my faith, is the one that gets most of the attention, most of the narrative, and also clouds a lot of the discussion. So we're looking at this from outside a faith-based perspective, but I'm going to tie it back in to see what we can do as a community to maybe bring that back in as well. So the first part of the model was grievance, right? So something is causing a tension, a crisis within the person, either real or perceived. So you might be upset that certain groups are perceived to be taking over the country, right? That could be a grievance that some people have. As a result of this grievance, it creates what he calls a cognitive opening and a vulnerable gap where the person is receptive to alternative ideas. Could be positive, could be neutral, could be negative, right? They're just open to susceptible ideas. Most importantly, though, grievance alone does not cause radicalization. And Steve, I have to apologize because I keep pointing here, but I keep pointing at your head. I don't mean to do that. There's no one outside like...
You have to be careful because it'll reflect off out there.
So grievance alone does not cause radicalization. That's one key thing to keep in mind. Because like I said earlier, each of us probably have some form of grievance within us about something, right? Whether it be a political system, whether it be, I know when I always have a parking ticket that U of A gave me that I didn't pay, but today I paid, so I know I'll get a ticket. But we all have some form of grievance. We also are guided by some form of ideology, right? And depending on where that ideology is coming from, it can provide context to that grievance, right? Building off of that cognitive opening like he talks about. So it can provide a way to cope with whatever grievance you might be thinking about. So we'll go back to that first example. If you're upset that some groups appear to be taking over the country, that's your grievance. A certain ideology might help you understand your grievance and provide you with a certain option to manage your grievance, right? So if you align with the political ideology that supports limiting immigration or anti-immigration, that's one ideology that's going to help you shape and form your grievance. But again, ideology and grievance together do not cause radicalization. The third aspect of his model is where there's some focus, and what he actually suggests for law enforcement specifically, grievance and ideology should not be their focus, right? I think that's a lot of times right now where law enforcement's focus is. It's on that grievance and ideology. What he suggests, though, is the focus should be more so on mobilization, right? Because under mobilization, this is where you have the connection of your grievance and your ideology, and it could turn into action, right? You might find like-minded people who are committed to the cause, and those like-minded people allow you to have that confidence to maybe take your cause to action. But again, positive action, neutral, or maybe even negative, right? But what he suggests is mobilization is the most useful starting point to counter whatever form of radicalization we might try to be combating. And I'll show you what that looks like near the end of my slide set here. I just have a few more things to go through before I end. We have this model, and again, this model alone might give us a useful starting point for how we understand radicalization, but for it to lead to some to commit violent forms of extremism, we have to understand the climate of hate, right? The climate of hate that is really fueling some of these grievances. And that's where you get those violent acts, right? That's where you go individuals going to public spaces and using violence. That's where you get, and I'll use a couple examples right now, maybe not going towards physical violence, but using protest as a form of violence to say, we do not want you here anymore based on how we define you as the other, like what we were talking about, that radical. So the climate of hate that I'm looking at right now, if we look at what happened in France, horrific event, right? Horrific event in France. And the fallout that's been happening in France and other European countries is quite alarming. But it highlights a climate of hate that is occurring there right now under this discussion about violent extremism and more broadly under how we understand radicalization. So you can see this is from January 19th, where there's been an increase in anti-Muslim crimes, right? I think one thing that struck me the most, 116 anti-Muslim incidents have been reported. The 2-week tally was more than double the number of instances recorded for the full month of January 2014, right? So trying to understand the climate of hate as a result of this radicalization discussion and this complex layers around radicalization. Germany right now is really interesting, right? Because there's one group, Pegida, who is trying to gather momentum and gather support for people to, using the analogy I talked about earlier, get rid of a certain group in their country who they feel are taking over, right? Muslims in Germany make up like 5% of the population, if that, but this group feels that that community is taking over. They've had, over the past couple of weeks, especially in the beginnings, right after the French instances happened, 18 to 20,000 people come into these protests in public spaces, in major cities in Germany, trying to suggest that a certain faith is responsible for all the ills in the world, and they don't want them to be in Germany anymore. To put it in context, can you imagine 18 to 20,000 people in Edmonton at Churchill Square protesting against a certain group? To me, that's violence. That's a form of protest violence. But at the same time, and I'm almost near the end here, I'm sure I went over time, so I apologize for that. But at the end of it, we can also use the same model to counter violent extremism, right? So as a community, have grievance towards those who might be espousing that climate of hate, right? Trying to counter those ideologies, but more importantly, coming together and mobilizing, and I'm happy to say, as they've been doing in Germany. Because for every 18 to 20,000 people that have been showing up in an anti-Islamic protest, there's been probably that much or double showing up more for a peaceful protest. And this group is actually now getting more momentum and more mobilization. This was taken from January 26th. So it goes back to how we can use that same model, not only to understand violent extremism, but for us as a community to counter that violent extremism. So I'll leave it at that for now. You can follow me on Twitter if you want to get this discussion going more. I don't want to just increase my Twitter follow count, but thank you very much for your time.